Thank you very much. I've never been in a tanning booth, but it's one here. Look at that, it's not bad here. No.
You can jacket off the skin.
Yeah.
Our skin looks great.
So we're here really, first and foremost, to celebrate this wonderful book, Many Subtle Channels, which I hope, I can't see anything anyway, but a little bit now. I don't know how many of you have read this book, but I recommend it highly. It's fun stuff, and I'm happy that the Harvard University Press put it out. I'd like to know more about that story now. And I couldn't help but do a Google search, I have to say, Daniel, earlier today, and find that one of the anagrams for this book, Many Subtle Channels, is Benali Munch Tenses. I don't know if you've come across that one. It's available, it's there. But there is nothing, there's nothing banal about this book. It's immensely enjoyable and very funny. And quite possibly, there are no children out there, I hope. One of the few books published by the Harvard University Press that includes a reference to porn stars named Cindy Cox, that's 3 X's, and Desiree Pigfuck.
It's actually just 2 X's.
Is it?
I was sort of distraught.
Galley, typo.
Sorry, everybody.
So, the book doesn't just tell the story of the Oulipo, a long-time literary collective. It's also a personal story about how Daniel fell in love with it, fell in love with what it is the Oulipians do, and how he traveled to Paris and became a member of the collective. It's a pretty select crowd. In fact, he's one of just 38 members, 17 of whom are dead. Is that correct? So, yeah.
17 of whom are dead, 1 of whom is imaginary.
I forgot that. So I want Daniel to tell a story, but also, of course, our other panelists I want them to talk about what it is they're up to and their involvement in experimental literature. And I'm hoping also maybe to hear from all of you and what you might be up to, if anything. And maybe at some point also, when I mentioned the cell phones, we might open this up to some sort of a challenge for you, a linguistic challenge, a constraint that you could play with and then get back to us on at the end of the 5-hour session that we're about to have here. So I thought maybe Daniel, to start off, in case you're not all Oulipian aficionados, maybe you could tell us. Well, first of all, we're here on a Thursday, right? And that's not an accident, I'm guessing. I thought this was totally planned. Tell us the significance of Thursdays.
Thursdays, for the last decade and a half, maybe, the Oulipo has done a monthly reading on the first Thursday of the month in Paris, and the word in French for Thursday, jeudi, can also be parsed as, if you spell it differently, as spoken game. So there's a little bit of beloved is too strong a word, but a tradition of public readings that the Oulipo does on the first Thursday of the month.
Or jeudi, I say.
Oh, right, or jeudi.
I say.
Any way you want to parse it.
So tell us a little bit about how you got involved with these crazy people. Not all crazy, I suppose, but...
Most people are mostly crazy.
Okay.
So the story, I'll try to abridge it as much as possible. In my first year in college, my freshman year, I took a French Lit survey course, and we read a story by Georges Perec that was part of our syllabus, and in passing, the professor mentioned that Perec had also written a 300-page mystery novel without using the letter E, which immediately I thought was one of the coolest things I'd ever heard, in part because about a year and a half prior, without any inkling that there was such a thing as the Oulipo, I had made a mixtape where the song titles and artist names also didn't contain the letter E. So there was this pretty encouraging revelation that there was a group of people out there who clearly had some of the same weird neuroses that I did. And I learned a little more about the group to which Perec belonged over the course of my college tenure, and then after college moved to Paris with a research grant to help catalog the Oulipo's archives in the National Library in France. And over the course of the 2.5 years I spent doing that, got to know the members of the group, and they got to know me, and eventually extended me an invitation for membership.
I guess this membership deal, I'm wondering about that. It's a very democratic organization, if you can call that, a collective, and yet so few members. I'm curious about that. I'm not sure you addressed it so much, not a criticism, but I'm wondering if any of you were to apply, what sort of ceremonies would you have to go through?
Well, first of all, you couldn't
chambers.
apply because asking to be a member renders you ineligible for life.
There we go.
Word to the wise. But I think the rationale for there not being very many members is A, there are not that many people in the world who think that this stuff is as rad as we do. And B, the idea is that it's not so much a literary movement as a pretty informal research group that meets once a month and has dinner and just kind of gabs about what they're interested in and what they've read lately and what they're writing. And one of the initial, not formal bylaws in the sense that if you ask to be a member, you can never be a member, but one of the guidelines is that it should be, the active membership should be limited to as many people as could fit comfortably around a dinner table.
This is also a fun group of people where they have and you can't be kicked out, you can't quit, right? There's even a clause for, I think, suicide as well.
There's only one way to formally leave the Oulipo, which is to commit suicide with the express purpose of leaving the Oulipo in the presence of a notary.
Who came up with that one?
I don't know who came up with that. Nobody's put it to the test so far.
Okay, so and then they've been around. I mean, it's not quite the French Academy, which has been around for centuries, but it's a good half century. It's 52 years now. Yeah, so it's a fairly venerable outfit.
Yes, I think it's arguably the longest lived French literary group. French literary groups being historically marked by a lot of schisms and infighting and general chaos.
So as I was saying, this is partly your story, going over there and documenting what it is that they do and your involvement with them. How much of this had been done before? I don't even know. I'm a book editor, I should know, but are there other, it doesn't seem there are other books, at least in English, that treat the subject.
There are two main books in English so far, not counting Scott's co-authored book that's coming out soon, about foretelling the end of the Oulipo, with a question mark. The first
Why we
is,
kept you guys apart.
yeah. The first is called A Primer of Potential Literature. Oulipo is an acronym in French that means Workshop for Potential Literature.
Let's hear the accent in French.
Ouvroir de littérature potentielle.
This guy's good.
It's all about not enunciating. So potential literature is this very nebulous idea that the book is in large part an attempt to grapple with that. But so the first book in English is called A Primer of Potential Literature, and it's translations of essays that members of the Oulipo have written at various times. There are a couple of manifestos, and there's a history of the Oulipo, and just a lot of, it's kind of a theoretical sampler of things that the group has been up to, and it was translated by a guy named Warren Motti, who's sort of the foremost American Oulipo scholar. And then there's a book called The Oulipo Compendium, which is a lot less serious, a lot more fun, and that was compiled by Harry Matthews and a couple of other English speakers. Harry Matthews is the other American member of the Oulipo. And that is kind of a glossary of Oulipian forms and techniques that just gives you examples of, for instance, what is a lipogram? A lipogram is a text that is written without one or more letters. So the book that I made reference to earlier by Perec is a lipogram in E because it doesn't contain the letter E. And it's just a sort of very fun, hard to digest in one sitting guide to the sorts of things that the Oulipo gets up to. But I found being a young, impressionable lad who was really fascinated by the idea of the Oulipo and wanted to know more, but whose interest was really visceral and not very not very intellectual, I would even say. I found that there was a lack of treatment of why people thought this was cool and who the people that were doing it actually were as people rather than as literary figures. And that's the book that I set out to write.
And a bit of a side note, maybe, but did your French accent come, or the lack of an accent, come after you learned about all these? You must have known a fair amount of French before going there.
I'd been learning French for several years in school, but when I learned about Oulipo, I'd never yet been to France. And I spent a semester studying in Nantes, and then I went to Paris after college, and that's where the accent came from, the immersion.
Yeah, tu es nantais, toi? Both. And it feels very impolite, sorry to be, it's like a dinner table where I'm talking to Daniel, excuse me, over here. So I want to involve you guys soon, but maybe first, Daniel, if you could read a little bit from the book to describe this thing, at least in this galley, on page 6, where you talk about Oulipian inquiry, that it's yielded novels. You wrote it, you know where it is.
I do now. I start on page 5. I describe Oulipo as a sort of literary supper club to which these two dudes that I've been talking about belong. A hallowed echo chamber for investigations of poetic form and narrative constraint and the mathematics of wordplay. Since its creation in 1960, Oulipo has served as the laboratory in which some of modernity's most inventive, challenging, and flat-out baffling textual experiments have been undertaken. The Beau Présent, which is a text that I made reference to earlier about, it's a poem addressed to somebody that contains only the letters in that person's name. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Oulipian inquiry has yielded novels without certain vowels, love stories without gender, poems without words, books that never end, books that do nothing but end, books that would technically take longer to read than most geological eras have lasted, books that share the exercise of mourning, books that aim to keep the reader from reading them, books that exist for no particular reason other than to amuse and perplex, books that may not actually exist at all. These works, all of them governed in some way by strict technical constraints or elaborate architectural designs, are attempts to prove the hypothesis that the most arbitrary structural mandates can be the most creatively liberating.
And it brought me back to, the first thing I thought of was the Dogma guys, and this is not literature, but I don't know if you've seen this film, The Five Obstructions. Have a beer and then speak. Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier, who's far crazier than any Oulipian. But it does show how liberating it can be to have these constraints, to make something on very little money, to do it as a cartoon, to have these rules. So that was a very cool thing about it, I think. So maybe we can move to you, gentlemen, now that, yes. Scott, tell us about the end and what you're up to.